Let's take a look at your book homework together. Your homework started on page 240, and it was to read this box here, 9.5, Modifying Comparatives. So, modifying comparatives sounds fancy, but we're just looking at words like very, much, a lot, and a little, or a little bit. Okay, so you can say something is bigger than something else, or you could say it's a lot bigger, right? Or you could say it's a little bigger. So it's giving a little bit more information about the comparison. So if you look at the top box, it says Tom is very old. So in a regular sentence where you're not comparing, you often use the word very to make it stronger, right? You could also say Anne drives very carefully. So very old, you're describing an adjective, how old. Very carefully, you're describing what? An adverb, right? So talking about how carefully. You could also say Tom is a little old, right? Or Anne drives a little bit carefully. So when you're making comparisons, you don't use very. So when you have Tom and I, and you're comparing us, you don't say Tom is very older than I. Or you wouldn't say Anne drives very more carefully. Okay? So when you're doing comparisons, you're going to use much, a lot, far. You also could use a little or a little bit. So those work in comparisons. So you would say Tom is much older than I am. Or Tom is a lot older than I am. Or Tom is far older than I am. So much and a lot and far, they all have the same meaning in this sentence. Far is a little bit old-fashioned. So I would encourage you to use much or a lot. Okay. And then here we have Anne drives more carefully than she used to. If we want to make that stronger, we can say much more carefully, a lot more carefully, or a little more old-fashioned, far more carefully than she used to. And then if you want to make something less strong, you would use a little or a little bit. So Ben is a little older than I am, or Ben is a little bit older than I am. We're just adding a little layer of detail to our comparisons. So let's look at exercise 19. And in this exercise, you have to decide, is the sentence a comparison or not? And then choose the right word to make it stronger or weaker. And you can change it the way that you want to. So for example, in number 1, it says it's hot today. So you could decide if you want to say it's very hot or it's a little hot, right? They don't give you that choice. These are your only choices. So this is not a comparison, so we can use very, right? We're just talking about today. We're not comparing to any other day. If you come down here to number 2, it says it's hotter today than yesterday. Is that one a comparison? Yes, right? We're comparing 2 days. So now we can't say it's very hotter. We could say it's much hotter. It's a lot hotter, or it's far hotter. So number 3, an airplane is fast. Is that a comparison? It is not. So we could say an airplane is very fast. What happened there? Got some weird extra stuff. Okay, an airplane is very fast, right? Then, taking an airplane is faster than driving. Now we're comparing 2 different things. So we could say taking an airplane is much faster than driving. Or you could say taking an airplane is a lot faster than driving. It's the same thing, right? learning a second language is difficult for many people. We're not comparing anything. We're not comparing the people. We're just making a statement here. Learning is difficult. Okay? So learning a second language is very difficult for many people. And then number 6, learning a second language is more difficult than learning chemistry formulas. So now we're comparing learning one thing and learning another thing. So learning a second language is, what would we say here? Much, right? Much more difficult, or a lot more difficult, or far more difficult than learning chemistry formulas. Now, maybe you don't think it's a lot. Maybe you think it's just a little. You could do that too. I'm just following the instructions here. But it's also okay to say learning a language is a little more difficult than learning chemistry formulas. Number 7, you can live more inexpensively in student housing than in rented apartment. Is that a comparison? Yes. We're comparing student housing and rented apartment. So we could say you can live much more inexpensively, a lot more inexpensively, or far more inexpensively in student housing than in a rented apartment. And then number 8, you can live inexpensively in student housing. In this one, we are not comparing anything. So we're not going to use much or a lot. We're going to use very, right? You can live very inexpensively in student housing. The second part of your homework on the next page was comparisons with less than and not as. So we've already talked about this a little bit, but this goes a little bit more into detail. So it says the opposite of ER or more is less, right? So a pen is less expensive than a book. A pen is not as expensive as a book. These have the same meaning. They both mean that the book is more expensive. We're just saying it the opposite way, right? So just like when you say more than, you also have to say less than, and you put the adjective in the middle. We don't have to worry too much about the syllables here because ER, you have to think, is it one syllable, is it two syllables, right? But with less than, you don't have to think about that. Also, when we do not as expensive as, we already looked at that construction a little bit, but remember, you have the not as, and then the adjective, and the as again. Okay. So less and not as expensive as are used with adjectives and adverbs of more than one syllable. The only thing special for you to remember here is in this case, when you have not as blank as. When you have one syllable adjectives like large, we only have one choice. We're going to say not as large as. We can't say less large. So with the one syllable adjectives, remember, not as, okay, instead of less. Let's look at our examples of that. So your homework for that was exercise 21. It says, my nephew is blank old blank my niece. So, can you say, my nephew is less old than my niece? Or not as old as my niece? So what's the rule for the one syllable adjectives? We have to use be, right? Let me write on it. Here. Not as. That looks weird. You understand. So not as old as my niece. You have to use this one. That work better? Yeah. Okay, number 2. My nephew is blank hardworking blank my niece. Hardworking. How many syllables? Hardworking. 3 syllables. So for our 3-syllable adjectives, we can say, my nephew is less hardworking than my niece, or we can say, my nephew is not as hardworking as my niece. We can do both. It's only those 1-syllable adjectives where we have one choice, right? Number 3, a bee is, what are we going to say? Big is 1 syllable, so we have to use not as. My brother is less interested in computers than I am, or not as interested in computers as I am. We can use both. Why? Because interested is more than 1 syllable. Let's look at number 5. Some students are less serious, not as serious. What do we choose here? Where's our adjective? Serious. Serious. How many syllables? Serious. 3 syllables. So we can choose less or not as serious. The meaning is the same, and we can use both. Finally, I am good at repairing things. What's the adjective here? Clearly, it's good, and that is obviously 1 syllable. So I am less good? Nope, we can't do it. We have to say not as good at repairing things as Diane.